everybody, welcome back to the channel. Now today's video is a masterclass in French polishing. French polishing is a really difficult thing to do. Over the years you'll find you'll hone your skills and find your techniques that work best for you, and a lot of people do the same thing in slightly different ways, and what I'm going to try and do today is go over all those little points that could be a problem. Sometimes you find that the finish doesn't look right, or you're struggling for the polish to stick to the finish. So we're going to look at a few aspects today. We've got this beautiful late Georgian linen press. A really great example, if I'm honest. It's got lovely side doors to it, lovely details, great overhanging cornice. You know, it's almost in the middle of that Georgian period, but it's just a little bit later. But it's very sun bleached. So we've got a few elements to discuss: how to lose that sun bleach, how far we go in the colour, how we strip off this sun bleached finish, how we restore the colour in the timber. And then we've also got pieces of veneer missing. A lot of the veneer on this is cross-banded, and cross-banding is when the veneer goes basically the weakest way that you could construct something. So they use a piece of timber to build the frame, make it strong and solid, and then they use some nice veneers to make it a little bit more decorative by having those veneers crossing the grain and running sort of from top to bottom on the thin sections. We're going to show you how to source the veneer to repair these repairs, match the colours, because obviously this is almost beautiful with its lovely faded colour, but it's just too faded. But at the same time, if we put a new piece of veneer on that's got that rich mahogany look, that's going to be too dark to blend in, and we don't want to go that dark on this. We want this to look like it's been in the country house for a couple of 100 years, not freshly polished and just out the showroom. So the first thing we'll do is talk about the stripping technique. Now the first section I'm going to do for you is this panel here, and I'm going to do that basically so we can start to see the contrast between this door. These doors are not hinged on, they're just resting there at the moment. The whole thing is not attached. We're going to take these doors off, and I'm going to begin by stripping this panel, and I'm going to use meths and fine wire wool. Now there are a few materials you can use to strip furniture. One is the paint strippers. There's an industrial one we use called Paramos. It's very strong, very effective, but on a piece like this, it's a little bit too much. And the reason that is, it will take so much off that it will revive a little bit more colour than I want to, and it will take a little bit too much of that character and history out of the timber. Meths is a lot softer way of doing it, and a fine wire wool is basically, that gives you the most time-consuming way to strip something, but it gives you the finest finish. The fine wire wool dissolves all that old shellac that's on the surface here, and as you're using the meth, it dissolves it and then sort of buffs it back into the surface. You take the bulk of it off, but a lot of it is rubbed into the wood grain, so it actually means it takes a lot less time to polish. If you overstrip something, you can add double the polish time, and if you think a piece like this could probably take a day and a half to French polish, if you strip it poorly, that can nudge up to 2 or 3 days. So it's worth taking the time to strip it properly. The most patient way is meths and wire wool, especially on the shellac that's sun bleached, perished a bit, and it'll come off relatively easy. On to the next bit. Okay, doors are off, it's time to strip this panel. Always wear your gloves with solvents, it's important. It can sink into your skin and it can cause you all sorts of complications. So wear your gloves, and to be honest, cleaning your hands afterwards is hard work for French polish. Methylated spirits, available in any hardware store. 4-0 wire wool, it's a little less common, but it's worth searching out for the right stuff. And when I say 4-0, I don't mean 40, I mean 0-0-0-0. It's the finest grade. It's a bit like, well, it's the opposite to sandpaper in terms of the way the scale works. So, bit of wire wool on your...
System shutdown.
Sorry. Bit of meth on your wire wool. And rub it on. And just leave it a bit wet. Give it time to start dissolving the shellac. As you'll realise later on, when you French polish something, it's a shellac dissolved or mixed with meths. And that methylated spirits thins it out and gives you a fine finish. If you try and do it without any methylated spirits, you end up with a very tacky, rough looking finish. It looks like it's been varnished badly. But you can see already, as that dissolves, it's starting to bring the colour out. Now, we're at an advantage here because this is such a good quality piece of furniture that it's made of good quality timber, and good quality timber polishes up a lot easier than poor quality timber. Now, although this is darkened straight away, that's because the meth is sitting on the surface. It will actually lighten up again as the meth dissolves. But what we're left with is essentially, we'll be left with a sun-bleached timber. Now, what we'll essentially be left with is a sun-bleached timber. Now, French polish has naturally got a golden tinge to it, and it's a really nice colour. So you've got to get the balance just right, where it's not too golden, a nice bit of nutty brown, a little bit of red hinting through. And that's where it comes from experience, knowing how the wood will react to what you do. And that only comes from practice. Now, originally, when I first put the meths on, the panel went really dark, and that's just dissolving into that perished finish. Essentially it's a bit spongy because it's been so sun bleached. Now, as it's starting to dry out again, it starts to lighten, and what that is the timber underneath, that sun-bleached timber. I think a bit of sun bleaching on mahogany is brilliant. You've got to get the level just right. You don't want it screaming red, brand new mahogany. And if I sanded this, that's what would happen. If I put an oxalic acid on it, which is a very dangerous chemical, only for professional use, that would become very red. So it's about that balance, understanding how far you want to strip it, to get the results you need. And really, no matter how much I talk to you about it on this, only experience can teach you that. Now, I've finished stripping this panel. I've used a fine wire woolen meth, which is the gentlest way of stripping something, and it's given me a really nice base to work with. There'll be no scratches, it'll keep some of that history, it'll take none of that surface off. That's really important to keep the age on something like this. Now, if I'd stripped half of this with a coarse wire wool, and I put the colour on like I'm about to, we'd have a dark section and a light section. That's because I would have opened up the grain and scratched the surface of the piece of furniture. If I sanded just a small section here, it would turn bright red. Mahogany is a bright red timber, especially at this period when it's all flamed. So it's important you don't bring that bright redness back out. We want this piece to continue its sort of natural look. It's the look of history and the look of provenance and patina. It has to be kept in a piece this special. So I'm going to put my stain on now, and you'll see it won't make that much of a difference. It'll make it a bit richer, it'll be a subtle finish, but it's that little lift that it needs to get right back to its former glory. Now for this, I use Rustin's wood dye. This isn't me endorsing their products, this is just what I use on a daily basis. This brown mahogany Rustin's wood dye is a nice colour for a good period mahogany. Sometimes, if I think the piece needs to be a little bit darker, I'll mix a few of their different stains together. But it's a nice thin stain, and you can put it on easy, rub it off easy. If it wasn't the right colour, I'd strip it off and start again. As it is, I think if I apply this with a rag now, it will give us just that little lift that's needed. And because I've sealed the surface well with a patient stripping, we should have a really nice colour. Ooh, look at that. That is lovely, isn't it? So that is all coloured. And this will mellow off also. Over 5 or 10 minutes as it dries, it almost disappears, but not quite. And that's the subtle difference that I want on this. And that's where experience and just being around furniture like this is so important. You need to know to what point to colour it and what point to polish it. Okay, so that stain will take a little time to dry. In the meantime, we're going to mix our French polish. Now there's a few different ways of mixing French polish. You can either start with crystals, it's like French polishing flakes, and you dissolve them in methylated spirits. It takes overnight really to do it properly. It's a little bit difficult to gauge the consistency of French polish because if it's too thick, you get a tacky finish. If it's too thin, it can be difficult to put on and then it can strip itself mid-process. That comes with experience. But as a rule of thumb, for a beginner, if you buy a bottle of liquid French polish, you dilute it 50-50 with methylated spirits, half and half. Put it into a bottle, and as you can see, ours has seen a bit of history. We use this because it's squeezy and it makes it easy to apply. An old washing up liquid bottle. I'll gauge that by look as much as anything. Once you've done this for a while, you learn to gauge the consistency just by giving it a little swish around and having a look at it. Second thing you need is to get the lid on right. Second thing you need is a French polishing rubber. Now that is made by wrapping cotton wool in a soft flannelette sheet. And it's really important you use a flannelette sheet. And for that, we go to auction houses or speak to the house clearance guys. Now, take a piece of rag. Show off my strength by tearing it. So this is a soft cotton cloth. I soak it first. Just to prepare it. And now in here I've got some of my old rubbers. But so in this pot I've got some of my old rubbers, but the rags have gotten a little bit dirty, and what happens is they pick up dirt over time and then you can't get a nice finish on it. And another point is, make the rubber the right size for the job you are doing. Now what I'm about to do with this panel is something quite small and intricate, so I don't want it to be too big and clumsy. If I'm doing a large dining table, I make a really big one. If I'm going over some small table base with intricate carvings, make it quite small, sort of like a fingertip rubber. Okay, so for this one, I'm going to make a rubber that size. Nice clean cloth, 50-50 mix. With the right technique, this should give me a lovely shine. Now this is where it starts to get technical, and this is where practice is everything. Your rubber needs to be tight, but not too tight. It needs to have some softness to sort of push into any of those corners. And what I'm doing is basically putting a very thin layer of French polish on, and the methylated spirits evaporates, it leaves the shellac on there, and then it's ready to be repeated, so you go over it again from all directions, filling up that grain. And what you've essentially got, if you imagine a sort of, I don't know, a big mountain range filling up with water till it goes smooth. It's those sort of dints in the grain that are getting filled with shellac, and when they are, they start to shine. Now this is starting to get a lovely shine. I love the colour, and I think when I hold the door up, we're going to have a beautiful contrast. But what's important to remember is all the little points, the fine wire wool, the methylated spirits, the certain wood stains, the right mix, the right cloth, the right density on your rubber, the right wetness of your rubber to apply the polish, when to go into the little corners, all these little things. If you get one of them wrong, it does not look right. So it's important to get them all right. It just comes with practice. If this didn't work and it looked a mess, I'd strip it off with the meths and wire wool again and start again. Don't be afraid to start again. Now, what will happen is this will dry out, sink in, and this shine will not be there in a few hours' time. I'll have to give it some more polish, and eventually that stops fading. We've obviously got the whole piece to do, which makes it a big job, and we've got veneer repairs to do. But now that I know what the original colour is, I know what colour veneer to select to make those repairs. Until this was done, I couldn't tell that. So it's important to get an area done first. I'm going to just give this a final polish, let it rest. We'll come back to it. I'll hold up the door now, and we can see just what a difference a simple, steady process has made. Okay, now that needs a little time to rest now because it will sink in. There's no point making it too shiny to start. You need that first level to sink in and dry out, and then you give it more polish and get a nice shine on it. But what I want to do now is hold the door up and give it a comparison test. Well, that's stunning. It's really brought out the natural colour of the timber. It's still got those mellow golds in it, which you really need on a piece of this age. We could have gone overboard and sanded it too much or stripped it too heavily and ended up with a bright red mahogany colour. That is not what this piece needs. And what it's got is that lovely honey, lovely mellow look to it. That is the colour that this thing should be. Welcome back. Now you're joining us about 2 days later here. Essentially what we do is we build up the polish, let it harden for a few hours, sometimes overnight, build it up again, because it will sink in overnight and start to look a bit matte. But eventually, as it is now, it becomes really shiny. And this is too shiny. As a nice original antique, it should have a nice, soft, original looking finish. As lovely as this finish is, this shiny is not for me and it won't be for my client either. So what we're going to do now is rub this down, use a very fine wire wool to take off that shine, use a wax to build up the shine in a more subtle way. And then I'm going to show you a little trick of the trade in terms of using a compound polish that can revive the shine onto something. And even if you've got an old piece of, say, Edwardian furniture, for example, these car compound finishes work really well. Okay, now obviously the wardrobe is too shiny, so we're going to dull this down, but we want to dull it down whilst maintaining the finish that we've just spent hours applying. I'll take this door off and pop it on my workbench. And then you can really see it's almost, well, simply too shiny. And it doesn't look like an antique, it looks like a freshly varnished piece of furniture. We're going to use an extra fine wire wool, 40 in grade, not 40, it's 0000. And it's almost like cotton wool, really soft, and we rub the whole thing down. Because we've given it enough time to harden, we can really go at it. And once we've got it rubbed down and softened off, we'll put a wax to bring back a shine, which won't be as shiny as this is, and it will give it a much more of a original antique look about it. Okay, now I'm going to start rubbing down with this extra fine wire wool. I go sort of with the grain where possible, but it's so fine it doesn't really make a difference. Any coarser and you'll leave lines on it. It just won't work. And you also need to make sure your French polish is hardened properly. If you haven't let it harden properly, it will become sticky, it will become scratched, and you won't get the finish that you need. And take your time with this. Just really gently, get a feel for it, get a feel for how your polish is reacting to the wire wool. And it's important, don't overuse your wire wool. Keep rotating it, keep turning it round. And then when it gets a little bit too straggly, then it's time to get a new piece, because you want to use it as like a big soft pad rather than a sort of sharp abrasive. And what you can see now is the shine is softening off, but it also softens off all those sharp edges. When you look at an antique, there are certain areas that shine. An original finish has certain areas that shine, and it's a real giveaway on something that's freshly Frenched polished.
System shut down.
Tied your tongue in. You can't even say that, I'm tongue tied today. And it's a real sign that something's been freshly polished when it just looks too sharp. So everything we do here and everything I French polish will get rubbed down and waxed. It's never left without. Now some restorers and some French polishers are quite happy using a bit of linseed oil on their rubber to get that final bit. And each to their own. But for me, on an antique, I think it needs to be rubbed down and waxed at the end. And it can take a long time, but it's important. There is nothing worse than an antique that's been over polished. It ruins it. So it's about knowing your levels, knowing what something should look like. And this is where all the elements of what we've been talking about become important. Having the right cloth for your rubber, having the right consistency of French polish, preparing your timber properly, knowing how much, sort of how far to go in terms of taking off any old polish and how much to disrupt the grain of the timber. What we had here was a very sun-bleached piece, but I think the colour on this is just perfect. That beautiful, natural golden finish is so important. And it can be very tempting to apply a stain and make it that rich, dark mahogany again, because, again, it does look beautiful. But for me, a piece like this needs to show its elegance through that softening off of its natural colours. Okay, now we've rubbed it down with our fine wire wool, like I said, nice and gently, just taking off that shine. We're not trying to scrub off the polish, we're trying to finish it in a finer way. We'll just dust this off now, and then we're going to apply our wax. And there are a lot of good wax companies, but it's important to use a good one. Gilboys are very good, Fiddy's are very good, Libron. Today we're using Bry Wax, and we're using a dark oak Bry Wax. Now, it may seem strange given the fact that we're polishing a sort of blonde golden piece of mahogany. This shouldn't change the colour that much. What this does is it fills the grain, it fills all those nooks and crannies, puts a bit of a dark edge into them, which will help it look antique. The finish itself, you know, whether I used a medium brown, a light brown, a clear, it'll be a very subtle difference, but because we're so light on this, a dark wax will do the job. I use a brush to buff it on, make sure you're getting all the nooks and crannies. That's important. This thing can't be left looking dusty afterwards. So I rub it on with a brush, making sure I'm covering every part of it. I don't leave it on too long because I don't want it to set hard on it. Doing small areas at a time. And once I've got the coverage I want of the small area that I'm waxing, I rub it off. Now, don't get tempted to speed up the job by waxing the whole thing in one go. If it's a new wax or it's a hot day and it's very sort of a little bit soft, you might get away with it. But what I like to do is leave the lids open on my wax, let the solvents evaporate and give a more concentrated beeswax. And in a later video, we're going to talk about how to wax something properly. For now, this is French polishing. And what you can see now is that we've got a lovely shine on those areas that I've just waxed. And it's a soft shine. It looks original, it looks antique. It doesn't look, well, like the rest of the cupboard looks at the moment. And that's what we want. It needs to be soft, it needs to be gentle. A nice subtle finish. And the way that we've now got all these black sort of grooves, as opposed to the French polish grooves on these, that now makes it look antique. So it's vitally important that you do this process. I'm going to finish waxing this whole door now. It might take me 10 minutes. When we're done, we'll hold them up and we'll have a look at the contrast between the two. Okay, so lovely wax door. Screw this back on. Now what we're going to see now is a difference that's subtle, but it's really important and it will really soften off the whole piece. So I'm hoping that this door and I'm hoping the camera can pick up the contrast between the panel next to this door and our freshly waxed door. And then I'm going to show you a little trick of the trade in terms of also softening off the finish, but at the same time adding a shine where something's gone a little bit grubby and a little bit dull. Beautiful. Now that is a subtle difference, but it's an important difference. And you can see, if you compare it to the panel, you've got that very rich colour that's just too fresh. And compared to the nicely waxed finish, well, I just think it's softer and it looks more like an antique should look. Now, as a final point here, I'm going to sort of give you a bit of a tip, and this is a technique we use on a number of occasions. If you've got a piece of furniture with a really good solid polished finish on it, a French polish finish, a shellac finish, then you can sort of revive that finish with a compound polish, very much like you revive the finish on a car. So the likes of T-cut compounds and car cutting compounds, used gently, can work really well on furniture. If you've got a piece of furniture that's, say, baked in old nicotine grime or just grubby and dirty, as long as that base foundation of polish is solid, it will revive it, clean it all off and give it such a polish that it can be absolutely gleaming. You need to be careful though, do not use it on a wax finish. If it's a wax finish, it will just take it straight off to bare timber. It has to be a good solid French polish finish, so it's important to try a small area first. In terms of using it on what we're doing today, I just want to highlight how it works in terms of putting a shine back on. If you like your furniture really shiny, but at the same time you don't want that freshly French polished and slightly tacky look, you can rub it down with wire wool, give it a compound finish, it softens off the edges and gives a better quality shine, but it does leave quite a shine. So what I'm going to do now is use this cutting compound on the bits that I've waxed and softened up, so you can sort of see a contrast between how it can revive that area. It will leave white in the grain when it's used, so it'll need a wax after that, but I suspect that when I use it on a small area of this now, we're going to get a really rich shine. Okay, a little bit on here, give it a good shake, because these are made up of a cream with a sort of an abrasive inside, so it's important to get that abrasive mixed in with all the cream. Just a very small area. I don't want it too concentrated, so I rub it into my rag so it's sort of just damp with the polish. And I think we will do an area in the middle at the top here. Now, because I put a really sort of good coat of French polish on this over the days, I won't risk rubbing through that French polish and back to bare wood. If this was only had a thin polish on, you run the risk of it going all the way through. Now that, again, is a subtle difference, but to my eyes, it's a big difference. This is where you've got to have your choice of preference, whether it's what your client wants or whether it's what you like. Personally, I like the soft waxed finish, and that's what I'm going to do on this whole thing, and I know that's what my client wants. The shiny finish, there's definitely a richer shine to it, and that process of rubbing down with fine wire wool and buffing with a compound gives it a sharper finish, a finer finish than not rubbing it down at all. So it is a process, but again, it's vitally important that the amount of polish and how solid it is on that surface, it needs to be solid, because if you rub it with a compound, you run the risk of going through to the bare timber, and then it's more French polishing time. And that is it. That is the process of French polishing. The important thing is all those elements need to be right, and you can't just pick it up and do it. It's practice, practice, practice. Grab yourself a piece of timber and keep going at it until you know, well, until you get a feel for it, because there's very much a matter of having a feel for it. You'll find times when you've put too much French polish in and it will go streaky and it keeps taking itself off and you can't seem to build the shine. Or you'll find that it's too shiny, it's looking tacky, and the grain isn't getting more full. It actually looks like it's getting deeper, and that's when you've got too much French polish. And if you're trying to correct that issue, it's not something you correct immediately. You remix your mix, you sort of dilute it in whichever way is necessary, and it takes about 5 minutes for that rubber to sort of dilute out before you can get a feel for it. But that's all experience, being able to look at your mixture, know how thick it is, how it feels when you're using the furniture. And I'd say if you find that you can't get an unstreaky finish, make a new rubber with the right cloth. A new rubber is always sort of, well, it makes finishing easier in terms of trying to use one that you've had in the pot for a while. And that's it. That's the masterclass in French polishing. Any questions, pop them in the comments. Please like and subscribe, because it does mean the world to us. And if you hang on, I'm going to explain to you why we haven't repaired the veneers on this yet, because that's coming in a later video. Shapow! Oh, that is a lovely colour.